Is peace possible, and why is Biden seemingly so hostile to negotiating and de-escalating?
Well, at this point, I think we have to conclude that there is a universal opposition to any peace arrangement that involves a recognition of any Russian success. In fact, if anything, it looks more and more as though Ukrainians are almost incidental to the operation in the sense that they are there to impale themselves on the Russian army and die in great numbers, because the real goal of this entire thing is the destruction of the Russian state and Vladimir Putin. And no one is prepared to stop anything as long as there is the slightest hope that something terrible will happen to Russia and to Putin. Of course, I don't see much evidence that that's going to be the case, but it doesn't really matter here. Everyone has universally signed on for the Russian hate campaign or hatred for Russia campaign, and that seems to go on regardless of what is reported. And frankly, the absence of much truth in reporting and a lot of wishful thinking in its place is hard to overestimate or exaggerate. It's terrible.
What do you make so far of the dominant narrative we're getting here in the U.S. that militarily that this has been a disaster for Russia, that Ukraine is putting up fierce resistance that Putin did not expect and has inflicted serious military defeat on the Russian invaders?
Well, as to the last point, it's very obvious that what Ukrainian forces are still active are entirely surrounded, cut off, and isolated in various towns and cities. The Ukrainian forces are incapable of anything but an occasional pinprick attack on something that doesn't appear to be very robust or dangerous. So the war, for all intents and purposes, has been decided. The issue for the Russians from the very beginning has been, how do we proceed without killing large numbers of civilians and inflicting a lot of property damage? And Putin gave very strict orders from the outset that they were to avoid these things. The problem with avoiding it is that it has slowed the progress of the operation to the point where it has given false hope both to the Ukrainians, but I think has been seized on by people in the West to try and convince the world that a defeat is in progress when in fact the opposite is the case. So the war itself at this stage of the game could be decided very, very rapidly, permanently, if Putin were to give the order and allow the forces to disregard the concern for civilians and property damage. But he hasn't done that. He has continued to negotiate, even though he recognizes that the people sitting across from him really are not in a position to deliver very much. They're being told what to do. And it's very obvious that Washington wants this to continue as long as possible in the hopes that Russia will be desperately harmed. I just don't see that happening. This morning, the latest polling data was given to me from eastern Poland about Russia, and 70% of the Russian population is firmly behind Vladimir Putin. That's a very large percentage in any conflict for any president to enjoy.
And that's up almost 10%.
Have allegedly lost 2,000 dead. I have no way of confirming that. Nobody else does. That may well be the case, but out of 200,000 forces, 200,000 troops, that's not an unreasonable amount for 3 weeks of fighting. The thousands of Ukrainians who've been killed, soldiers, is anyone's guess, because obviously Kiev isn't going to report that honestly. We're going to get inflated figures for their opponents and untrue figures for themselves. So I think the big problem right now is that in the West, there is no truth. There is wishful thinking, and there is this impression of success by the Ukrainians that doesn't stack up. In fact, the Russians are capturing large quantities of Western equipment, British and American, that are being shipped to them at this point.
Yeah, we have a map from South Front, which I think might be more accurate than the Kagan's think tank, the Institute for the Study of War. Right to your left, I'm not sure if you see it on screen, but as you see, the red marks Russian positions, the Russian incursion. And if you look to the north of Ukraine, just north of Kiev, you can see Russia forming positions around Kiev and essentially encircling that's my view, encircling divisions of the Ukrainian military. And then in the east, there's a rapid advance, not only of Russian forces, but forces from Lugansk and Donetsk, who are technically, according to the U.S., Ukrainian, and you can see pockets there, which I would call cauldrons. Can you give us an assessment based on what you see of this map as of March 14th?
Well, on the southeastern side, towards the bottom, you have as many as 60,000 Ukrainian troops that are completely surrounded in what the Russians are referring to as a cauldron. That's been going on for several days now. No one knows what the status of those forces is. They're probably running out of water, supplies, ammunition. The Russians would prefer that they surrender. Some have, but there may be pressure now to end this, which would result in the mass slaughter of some 60,000 troops. And I don't think the Russians are interested in that. I think what the Russians are interested in is what you see. They've gone to the large population centers. They've tried to avoid the central portion of Ukraine, because that's the agricultural area. In fact, Russian troops have been told to stay out of the fields. The Russians realize that we're on the verge of spring planting in Ukraine. They're not interested in destroying the wheat and barley crops at all. They would prefer to see that go ahead. So the issue for the Russians right now is that everything worth controlling is controlled. This notion that you hear over and over and over again on television, well, they haven't increased their territorial control. They're not interested in territory. The entire operation from day one was focused on the destruction of Ukrainian forces. That's largely complete, with the exception of those that are still surrounded. They've got a huge problem in Mariupol, which is off to the right, where you have roughly 3,000 of these fanatical fighters in the Azov regiment or battalion, whatever you want to call it, who are refusing to allow any of the civilians in the city to leave. In fact, I saw footage this morning of these Ukrainian Azov troops telling the population there, you can't leave, even though the Russians had opened a corridor for humanitarian assistance and evacuation. Again, these things are not reported in the West because it tends to damage the narrative. So my great concern is the determination to annihilate the Azov crowd could result in real destruction in Mariupol, which would be terrible for the people there. But again, one doesn't know what the thinking is at higher levels. I suspect there's a desire to end this, get this over with. But as long as Zelensky stalls, the more Ukrainian forces will be killed. And it doesn't make any difference how much we try to ship into Ukraine. They can't assimilate it and use it effectively in any case at this point. But again, this satisfies the narrative that the Russians are losing. Putin is evil and must be driven out, and he's the aggressor. All of the information going back to 2014 and earlier is essentially deleted from the discussion. The fact that they've lost 14,000 people killed in the war since 2014 that the Ukrainians have waged relentlessly against the Russians in the East, that's ignored. So it's very tragic, but I think what will happen is the truth will out. Eventually, this will end. The Russians will be successful in what they've set out to do, and the Ukrainians will be destroyed. I'd rather not see that. I don't think Putin wants to see that. Remember, he's fighting against people that he largely considers to be very much like himself. There is no desire to murder all of these people, contrary to popular belief. The biggest lie I've heard repeated on television is Russian troops have been told to deliberately murder civilians, Ukrainian civilians. It's absurd. It's nonsense. Nothing could be further from the truth. Do they make mistakes? Do munitions fall on things they'd rather not? Of course, we make those mistakes. Every military organization does. But it is as ridiculous to assert that the Russians are deliberately murdering civilians as it was to assert when we were in Vietnam, or then subsequently involved in other wars in the Middle East, that we were deliberately murdering civilians. We were not. We didn't always tell the truth about it. In the sense, when we made mistakes, we tried to dress it up. But the truth is, we never set out to do those things. I don't see any evidence that they are doing it either. If they were, this would have been over 10 days ago.
I would take issue with the idea that we weren't setting out to deliberately kill civilians. I'm reminded of Henry Kissinger saying in Cambodia, anything that flies on anything that moves. I mean, that was essentially a call for genocide.
Aaron, you can fight that war with somebody else. I'm telling you that
enough.
As a soldier in the United States Army and my experience with people in those forces, they don't deliberately murder civilians.
Okay, we can have that discussion another time. Let me ask you on the question of the U.S. arming Ukraine. You have people right now like Amy Klobuchar, Rob Portman. They're in Poland. They're saying that if we can get those jets from Poland to Ukraine, that can make a difference. Can you address that argument and this widespread notion in Washington that if more weapons could be sent to Ukraine, that could turn the tide in Ukraine's favor?
Well, obviously, it's not going to turn any tide whatsoever. It does seem as though many people on the Hill, obviously responding to their donors, want to widen and escalate the war on the assumption that somehow or another the Russians are weak, that Mr. Putin is sitting on a wobbly throne, all that sort of business. It's not true. And if we actually intervene against Russian forces on the ground in eastern Ukraine in any meaningful way, we will end up at war with Russia. And that war will escalate horizontally as well as vertically. So that up to and including the use of nuclear weapons. Remember, nuclear weapons only have value in the modern world in terms of their potential to protect your territorial integrity. That's it. The use of a nuclear weapon in any other situation is so destructive that no one sees any military utility to it. And no one wants to use it because it would have horrific consequences on the ground for anybody who's near it. And keep in mind that if we were to use a nuclear weapon, or Russians were, you would end up with the prevailing winds blowing the fallout across Central Asia into northeast China, Korea, and Japan. The whole idea is insane. However, we have been flying B-52s very close to Russian airspace. We've moved our submarines close to them. They have detected this presence. They have no idea whether the aircraft are carrying nuclear weapons or conventional weapons. They have no way of knowing what the submarines may or may not use. And as a result, they've gone to this alert, high nuclear alert, which is very dangerous. And their detection capability, in other words, the ability of their radars and their satellites to detect launches from us, is not nearly as good as ours. They are behind in that area, which means that you may end up with some people that report that a launch is imminent or they are under attack by someone with a nuclear weapon when it's not. So there is room for serious mistakes there. But no one should doubt the willingness, if they feel that their territory is going to be threatened with an attack with nuclear weapons, they will launch a strike against us. And that will bring the war to North America, to the United States.
Aaron mentioned Colonel Douglas Macgregor, that there was discussion or put a push in Washington to deliver MiG-29 fighters to Ukraine, I guess, so the ghost of Kiev can get up there and continue knocking down dozens and dozens of Russian jets. Seemingly fantastical. Nancy Pelosi, in her rambling discussion of the war yesterday, I kind of am tempted to play video of it, where she fantasized about taking out the Russian convoy, wished for the MiG-29 delivery from Poland, and said the U.S. would backfill it. And this is obviously because, you know, Ukrainian pilots are trained to fly those and not U.S. aircraft, et cetera. But it seems like such an insane plan that even Biden opposed it. And so,
first of all, let's give credit where credit's due, Max.
Yeah.
The president of the United States has made some very good decisions. He's made it very clear. Number one, we will not send any ground forces into Ukraine. Remember, there was some discussion at the beginning of whether or not our forces or troops would go into Ukraine to rescue American citizens. Right. Absolutely not. We will not go into Ukraine under any circumstances on the ground. Then, when the new no-fly zone was raised, it's perfectly obvious that if you send any NATO aircraft into Ukrainian airspace, the Russians are going to shoot them down, in which case you're at war with Russia. He said, absolutely not. So then they came up with the third scheme, and this was, of course, Anthony Blinken, who kept pushing for this on the assumption that, well, we shouldn't be afraid of Mr. Putin. Mr. Putin won't respond. I listened to Senator Lindsey Graham, a man with infinite military experience as an attorney serving in the Staff Judge Advocates Corps on military duty in places like Iraq. And he certainly understands that no matter what we do, Mr. Putin won't respond. Mr. Putin is intimidated by us, and we can do pretty much what we want. This is a huge problem. For the first time, certainly in living memory, I heard Senator Rubio actually say something yesterday that I thought was exceptionally intelligent. And he announced to everyone, Russia is not Iraq. Gosh, what an insight. Russia is not Iraq. And therefore, he said, no, we can't do the no-fly zone and we can't transfer those MiGs. So there is some evidence for rationality in the Senate. But unfortunately, people like Graham continue to argue. You've got Mr. Blinken, who has some rather strange ideas about what the Russians will or won't do. He's going to continue to push for dumb ideas. The key question is, can President Biden retain his presence of mind and continue to say no to these dumb ideas? I don't know. I hope so. So I credit him with common sense on that level. And I think he's letting the people on the Hill say and do otherwise what they want because he knows they're answering to donors. I mean, we don't care about the people that elect us to office anymore. They're irrelevant. Donors are everything. Donors run the city. So they're responding to donors who obviously want to find ways to widen and escalate the conflict. But I don't think the president does, and he will stop it any opportunity he has to do so.
Well, it sounds like, and this goes directly to my question, it sounds like you're identifying a particular faction in the Biden administration that wants to escalate this war. That is the real war party, and you're locating them in the State Department. Based on your own experience in an administration, I know that the kind of neoconservative and more hardline elements were not elevated the way they are in the Biden administration. But can you just address maybe the tension between the State Department, particularly the Blinken State Department, and the Pentagon, which seemed opposed to this MiG-29 transfer idea?
The Department of Defense, at least on the uniform side, is dominated by people who, for the most part, don't want to have to fight a real war against a real enemy that can fight back. They know that we're not prepared for that. They know that our forces are woefully unprepared, untrained, and ill-equipped. They know this because they've had a hand in creating the mess that we have today inside the Department of Defense. So someone like General Mark Milley will advise, under no circumstances provoke the Russians, under no circumstances drag us into this. We're not ready. That much is clear. The problem is there are other hotheads, and I think it's a mistake to talk exclusively about the administration. I think we need to understand that this really is the uniparty. Democrat versus Republican labels are irrelevant. They're all responding to the same collection of donors. The donors want conflict. The donors enjoy conflict, enrich themselves as a result of conflict, and the donors grossly underestimate the dangers because the donors have no real experience on the ground in the military. They don't know what they're dealing with. I read a number of reports that were given by former soldiers in the United States Army, Special Operations Forces, and Marines who have since been to Ukraine and come back. And they recorded with horror what it was like to fight against the Russians and said, don't come over here. If you do, you're going to get killed. This is a real army. This is real high intensity conventional warfare. Forget it. Our experience is irrelevant. And they're right. People that were able to essentially do whatever they want because we dominated people in Iraq and Afghanistan with overwhelming firepower, people that had no armies, no air forces, no air defenses, they know that this will not work. Problem is that that's irrelevant to the people on the Hill. They are, again, performing for donors. And sadly, there are people out there in the United States, I call it the Bombs Away Club. There are people in the Bombs Away Club who are always prepared to bomb anybody and attack anybody. They think this is some manifestation of our greatness. And then you have the preoccupation with bullying everyone. The State Department is accustomed to bullying others, bullying them into acceptance of whatever policy stance we want them to take. I think that's going to end as a result of this conflict, because over time, many of the Europeans have now realized what the Indians, the Chinese, most Asians have figured out, most of Africa and Latin America, that we are bullies, that we inevitably end up in a position where if you don't agree with us, we brand you as the enemy and we try to punish you with control of our financial system. I think that's going to end. I don't see this ending badly necessarily for Russia. Russia is going to be hurt. Anytime you fight any war, you were hurt. Look at us during the Second World War. How long did it take us to recover from that war? And it was not easy. But the point is, they will come out of it. And the Chinese, thanks to Jake Sullivan, who met with the foreign minister in Rome, have seen the wisdom of reaffirming their support for Russia now, because he went in and essentially threatened the Chinese. Our instantaneous response to anyone who doesn't agree is to threaten. We don't practice something the British Empire used to practice, at least until World War I, which was economy of enemies. We go in and say, you're with us or you're against us. Whereas the British usually went into some place and said, well, who can we work with? And who is neutral? And who can we bring on side? And who is the real problem? Perhaps we can isolate that individual or those people. We don't think in those terms. And this is part of the moral hypocrisy, but it comes with the globalist, Marxist, elitist mentality. We have a monopoly, they think, on wisdom, morality, decency, and anyone who opposes them is, of course, the opposite.
Our Marxist fans are going to take issue with that one.